George, all my life I've wanted to understand the physical world, and I was trained as a scientist, but I've always had this great love of philosophy. Then I read where you say that we have to overturn 2,500 years of Western philosophy. Why?
Well, because it got the mind wrong. And that is
Pretty serious charge.
very, very, well, I wouldn't call it a charge. I mean, look, the wonderful things about Western philosophy is that it opened up questions. They're marvelous questions. The questions came out of metaphors that we normally live in terms of that we don't even know are there. They came out of, the idea that we can understand the world in itself, that without any structuring externally. And that turns out to be false. And it's false on the scientific grounds. It's not a matter of religion or faith or anything like that. What we know from cognitive science and neuroscience is you think with your brain. And you have no choice. That's all you've got. It turns out that thought is embodied because the brain not only has a structure in itself, but that structure is there to run a body. And every concept you have has to be instantiated in your brain, but the brain is not a general purpose concepts generator. The brain has a structure that is embodied, and the concepts you have can only come out of that body. And the question is, how exactly does that work? And in cognitive science and neuroscience, when you put all of that together, neurocomputation, work on fMRI research, psychological experiments, plus the cognitive semantics research, what it shows is that our conceptual system does not just fit the world in itself. In a very simple way, when you learn about the physiology of color, color is not out there in the world. Color has to do with four things. It has to do with two things having to do with the world and two things having to do with you. One, you have wavelength reflection, and you have related lighting in the world. The parts that have to do with you have to do with your color cones and your neural circuitry. Color is created out of all of those four things. When you see, let's say, a red car, the redness isn't in the car. That car reflects certain wavelengths, but wavelength isn't color. Color goes over many, many wavelengths and depends on lighting conditions and so on. But it also has to do with what's going on in your brain. Your brain and your body are creating color and color categories. They wouldn't exist otherwise. But it's not just color, it's everything. And that's the shocker. The shocker is we understand the world in terms of what we can do with our bodies, but we evolved to be able to do a lot with our bodies and to be able to function well in the world. And we all pretty much have certain aspects of our bodies and brains that are the same. The remarkable thing is that our conceptual system is structured around that. So, for example, we have what cognitive semanticists call image schemas for understanding the world. And these come out of certain brain structures that compute them. So we all understand the world in terms of bounded regions in space, containers. And you, even if you say the bees are swarming in the garden, you're imposing a container structure on the garden. But then you also have source paths and goals that you compute. You have notions of rotation and circularity that are there, and we have brain structures that allow us to rotate things in our minds. We have many, many kinds of image schemas that are there and that have a logic to them. So
and you're saying we impose that on the world?
We impose it on the world. And sometimes it fits very well. It's not that it's crazy, because we evolved to do very well. But so, for example, if you're in the middle of a jungle and you have a clearing, you impose a container structure and you can be in the clearing or outside the clearing. That doesn't mean that the world doesn't have a structure, but we understand it in terms of what we have. This is not a relativist position. It's a position that says we evolved to be able to function well in the world, but it's not like the structure of our mind is in the world. It isn't like that at all with color or with most other things.
Now, this is not a skeptical position. You're not saying that you have no way of knowing what's real.
No, not at all.
Right.
We are. I would call myself an embodied realist. That is, you have to take into account the effects of the body and brain in understanding reality. Reality is real; it's there, and the body and brain are real. They're part of reality. But what's important is that our understanding is crucially that way.
Okay, so this is one major point, the embodied mind, which is our brain. Now you have another couple of major points that you used in which to frame philosophical analysis.
Sure. Well, one of the most important parts of that is that a lot of our thought is metaphorical. And metaphor is not just in language, it's in the way we understand the world. And the most remarkable part of it is that metaphors, you think of them as being in language, but that's sort of the surface form of them. They're actually ways of thinking. They're mappings from one conceptual domain to another. But the whole system of metaphor, and we have thousands of them that are unconscious that we think in terms of every day, is based on what are called primary metaphors. These are metaphors that arise just through functioning in the world that you don't even know are there, and they arise because of the way brains function. So, for example, more is up and less is down. We turn the radio up, prices rise, they fall, they skyrocket, etc. Why? Well, every day you pour more water in the glass, the level goes up. You pile books on the desk, the level goes up. Well, there's a correlation in your experience. And quantity and verticality are computed in different parts of the brain. What happens is you have regular activation of both at once. When that happens, you get neural connections through spreading activation through the brain between them until they eventually come together, because you experience them together, activated together over and over until you form a circuit between them. And that circuit is the metaphor. It's a physical connection between them that allows you to understand quantity in terms of verticality. Let me give you another example. Affection is warmth. A cold person, a warm person. That's not arbitrary. You know, you're held as a child, and there's a correlation between affection and warmth over and over. And the emotional regions of the brain and the parts of the brain that compute temperature are in different places. You have a spreading between them, and you form a connection that is a metaphor.
So this metaphor really then becomes truly embodied by synaptic circuitry.
Exactly. That is, the synapses change and you form circuits, and the circuits are of the form, they are asymmetric for reasons we can go into, and they form primary metaphors, and then those can come together in forming very complex metaphors that we have. But what appears to be the case is that the primary ones look universal when the experiences are universal. And
you also talk about a third concept, that thought is unconscious.
Right.
Is that related to the metaphor?
Absolutely. Most of these primary metaphors are unconscious. And not just the metaphors are. Most concepts are unconscious. You don't know your conceptual system. You can't tell me, well, we found out there are thousands of concepts. Tell me about 300 of them. You can't do it, right? There's no way. We know how to study that in cognitive science. We know how to go look at the details of what a conceptual system looks like, the details of what a frame structure looks like. We think in terms of what a structure is called frames. But it's unconscious, and 98% is the estimate that certain neuroscientists have suggested. But it's what your brain is doing when you're busy doing other conscious things.
Okay, so now take these three concepts, the embodied mind, metaphor, the power of metaphor, and then the unconscious thought of metaphor. And how does that then reformulate philosophy?
Well, first of all, it says that anything you understand is coming through your body, and it's not just out there in the world. So whether it was Plato or Aristotle assumed that there were essences in the world and your mind could just directly grasp it. Descartes said there's a structure in the world, there's a mind that is abstract, and that we could just, God wouldn't lie to us, he did, we can connect. The Anglo-American philosophers say we have a relationship in which the words or concepts fit the world. Well, how? It turns out metaphorically they can't, but other structures can't just fit the world, are concepts are not out there in the world in themselves. They come about through our interactions with the world.
So let's integrate it together. We have the embodied mind. We have the critical importance of metaphor and that most thought is unconscious. How collectively does that impact all of Western philosophy?
Well, the assumption behind Western philosophy is that we can know the world in itself. But if you're knowing the world through your body, then you don't just know it in itself. You know it only in terms of what the body will allow. And the body allows a lot, but it isn't directly fitting. In addition, a lot of philosophy is itself metaphorical. So Aristotle thought that there were essences out in the world and our minds could just go out and grasp those essences. And Descartes assumed that there was a special mental substance separate from the body, but that God allowed us to know the world directly. And Anglo-American philosophy assumes that words or concepts could just fit the world directly in themselves, that truth could be defined in terms of a word-to-world relationship, without looking at how the body affects the brain and the mind, without looking at the fact that a lot of our thought is metaphorical and the philosophy itself is.
So that would mean that virtually every philosophical position needs to be at least re-examined to see if it doesn't make some mistakes that violates one of these principles.
Well, that's exactly right. In philosophy, you don't want to say the world is flat. You similarly don't want to say that thinking occurs without the brain, that thought is non-metaphorical. You want to look at the metaphors in the philosophy itself and ask where they come from and do they affect the philosophy. This is a hyper-realist position. It's a realist position that not only says the world is real, but our means of understanding it is real and we have to study it. Philosophers very often assume that philosophy is the ultimate subject matter, that you could just do philosophy and then you could study the philosophy of linguistics, the philosophy of cognitive science, the philosophy of physics. But philosophy uses the mind. And the mind is something that you can study empirically, and that depends on the brain. And that is left out of philosophy.